Welcome, APUSH students. We are in a continuation of chapter 31, okay, where we talked about President Ford and President Ford losing the 76 election. We talked about President Carter and his failures regarding improving the economy and his failure regarding the Iran hostage crisis as well. And we see a definite movement to a conservative 1980s. Okay, as opposed to many of the liberal movements of the 60s and the 70s. Okay, and so here you have the 1980s being dominated by 2 terms of Ronald Reagan, right? And 1 term of his vice president becoming president, right? George Bush. And notice the motto, let's make America great again. Maybe you have seen that motto before. Interesting, or something similar. Okay, the Sunbelt. What happens is that we see the population of the United States now moving. As we saw the Great Migration in the 20s and then even later in the 1950s, where a large number of African Americans were moving out of the South, right? And then moving up and going to northern cities for manufacturing jobs. We see a large number of people moving to states such as Florida, moving to states such as Texas, moving to states such as Arizona and California. More land, more opportunity, more jobs. Okay? And what we see here is the beginning of these type of rebellions against regulations, that the government is too large. The government is making too many rules and putting too many obstacles in the way of people's economic development and job opportunities. Okay? We also see a definite rise in the idea of conservatives, right? So we see a large number of people, especially white, middle class, upper middle class, leaving the inner cities. We had already talked about this going to the 1950s with Levittown, right? And going out to the suburbs, and these people are becoming more and more conservatives. Okay? We have the growth of Evangelical Christianity, right? Remember, we already talked about the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, right? And so we have preachers coming in now and becoming similar to movie stars and rock stars. Billy Graham, okay? Oral Roberts. And they stressed a direct personal relationship with Jesus, such as the Great Awakening. Okay? Now, this is the difference, though, between the Great Awakening, right, and Evangelical Christianity. One major difference is now you have an emphasis on economic development, and you have many more means of communication getting your message out. Okay? So many of these groups had their own magazines, their own radio stations, their own TV networks, right? And even their own colleges in order to spread their message and ideas and also to ask for money. Okay? And what they did is they feared the growth of immorality and disorder, and they sought to protect the traditional family unit. And you say, well, what decade does that sound similar to in modern times? Well, yeah, the 1950s, of course, right? And all the TV shows that you watch, such as Leave It to Beaver and so on, right? Which really stress the importance of the family unit, okay? And that once the family unit breaks apart, you're literally breaking apart Western civilization, right? It's going to lead to disunity. It's going to lead to immoral action. It's going to lead to criminal behavior, okay? They railed against pornography. They railed against abortion, right? And also were upset that public schools were eliminating religion, okay? This idea not only attracted many Protestants, right, who are the evangelical Christians, right? But it also had many ideas which stressed that were basically, I would say, connections to Catholic and Mormons as well. So this evangelical Christianity was a large, broad movement made up of many different types or sects of Christianity, Catholicism, and so on. Okay? Well, they call them the New Right, okay? The New Conservative Movement. And many people trace it back to a politician from Arizona named Barry Goldwater, who was extremely conservative. He was never able to win the presidency, probably because most people considered him too right-wing, or this was before his time, the 1960s, that we weren't ready for this conservative reaction to the liberalism of the 70s, okay, until the 1980s, okay? The New Right was a reaction to the New Deal. Government spending too much money, helping too many people out, Okay? The Great Society, right? Lyndon Johnson's program of spending money, that America was creating a welfare state, a state in which people were dependent on the government and not their own hard work and their own intellect. Okay? It was a reaction against the sexual revolution, right? The free love of the hippies, the feminism, the reaction against women leaving the workplace, the reaction against men and women living together, I should say, without being married, the reaction against the gay rights movement as well. Okay? The reaction against affirmative action, right? That perhaps disadvantaged people traditionally, such as African American, such as even as women, other minorities, right, are given more of an opportunity to perhaps enter college, get a job, work for the city, and so on. That was also basically going against their conservative values, right? And really, what all these things amounted to, all of these protests, right? The liberal Supreme Court ideas of the 1960s, all of these government and welfare programs, it led to a breakdown of what made America great, no pun intended, right? That American values are work values, family values, religious values, okay? Their reaction against President Ford, who basically didn't get the job done, okay? They were against the appointment of the Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, who was from an elitist, from an extremely wealthy family, the Rockefeller family from New York, that Ford and Rockefeller did not share these conservative ideals of the people we call the New Right, right? They were also against people who wanted amnesty for draft dodgers. So the thousands of Americans who left didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War, and so escaped to Canada or maybe some other countries, right? And give them amnesty, which means you can come back without being punished. They were against that as well. Okay? They also did not appreciate how presidents such as Nixon, Ford, and Carter all pursued a friendlier relationship with the Soviet Union as well. So you see, their beef is not only with, obviously, Democrats, but their beef is also with these Republican leaders who they felt were too liberal as well, okay? And obviously upset with the fall of Vietnam. And what we see here, right, is the 1980s. Wow, you look at the 1980 election, and Reagan wins 90% of the electoral college, okay? Carter only wins a few states, and one of them his home state of Georgia. So basically, it's similar to what we would call a mandate, meaning Reagan won, conservative ideas, conservative values of the 1980s, they have won, and this is what the majority of Americans want. Okay? The campaign in 1980, similar to all the ideas that we have talked about. Remember, Reagan had already been the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was already known as a fervent anti-communist in the 1950s. He had been the governor of California as well. 1976, right, he ran against Ford to be the representative for the Republican Party and was able to put his name on the national spotlight as well. And he also brings in Vice President George Bush, who we will talk about as well, okay? Well, the 1980s, what do they want? Lower taxes. There's a taxpayers' revolt. Howard Jarvis leads this institute, which talks about the property taxes going sky high, and so California voted against that as well, right? Anti-busing. So basically what happened is many cities, in order to be desegregated, in order to get many different groups together, to have black students, white students, and Hispanic students to go to the same school, even if they live far apart, you force kids to get on a bus and drive outside of their neighborhood. They were against that. There's a Supreme Court case, right? Bakke said he did not get into a medical school, right? He had better grades, better test scores, but because he was white, okay? And this is an example, right, of the unfairness of affirmative action, okay? They want deregulation. Deregulation means get rid of all of the obstacles. Get rid of the government making so many rules. The more rules the government makes, the less likely you are to try to open a business. the more likely it is that you're going to have to spend more money following all these rules. And what's going to happen is that the price is going to go up because this business has to follow so many rules and regulations, right? They're anti-abortion, they're anti-equal rights amendment, and they're for school prayer in public schools. Okay? They also want states to be able to make most of their own decisions. They want to reduce government spending and promise a balanced budget. And honestly, promise a balanced budget is a joke. The budget is going to go sky high. The debt is going to increase tremendously. Why is the budget going to increase tremendously? Even though the United States is technically not in war in the 1980s, right? Because they're going to increase defense spending. Carter's idea of only spending money or getting involved in countries where human rights is at question, okay, is thrown out the window. Basically, the Reaganites of the 80s feel that America is losing its place, its prestige in the world because we're too soft on communism. Sounds like the 1950s again, doesn't it, right? That America is no longer a world-respected power, so the United States is going to increase their defense spending. And basically, what happens is how Reagan wins. One of his famous lines, okay, from one of the debates is simply this. He says, all you have to do when you go out to the voting polls is ask yourself one question. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And obviously, most Americans said, no, we are not better off. So they chose to vote for Ronald Reagan. Okay? Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you later.